Good morning. Today is the day before Passover begins. Today is on our calendar, April the 7th, 2020. And I want to continue during this Holy Week for Christians on this Tuesday morning to talk to you about the parallels with Passover and all that surrounds it, not just at the actual time of the first Passover, but in the keeping of the Passover. Because the Israelites were instructed to keep this as a memorial forever. And in 1 Corinthians 10, Paul talks about the Passover and these things that happened to the children of Israel as being an example for all of us. And the word that Paul uses there in the original language in the Greek is typikos, which you're probably going to pick on pretty quick if you, even if you haven't had Greek. It sounds like typical or type. In this case, a type or that's why it's translated as an example. I'm standing here at a little bubbling brook that in some places the Jordan River actually resembles this. In other places, it widens out into a kind of a marshy area. But I want to walk over here and just kind of sit down and talk to you next to this bubbling brook for 5 minutes or so and see if we can't unpack a couple of things and go into them for the next few days, hopefully, as we're going through this Passover time. Please excuse my hand in front of the microphone, or the camera rather. The God of the spirits of all flesh is how number 16 talks about the Lord. I think it's in verse 22. And he revealed himself in the Passover, the word tells us, as that pattern or as that type. And it's talked about both in the Old Testament and New Testament. He was sharing a kind of a complementary plumb line for us with the entire human race through the Jewish people. And it would be important to understand that the Jewish people have this spiritual inheritance. It's talked about in Romans chapter 15, verse 27. They have this abiding calling, and it's irrevocable as a priority in human and spiritual history. You can see that back in Romans 11:29. And he wants the nations to gain wisdom from studying and understanding these, thus the reference to the types. With that in mind, I want to take a look at Passover in this instance, just as the actual day being important. There's the feast and all that surrounding. But if you look in your Bibles in Psalm 78 and in Exodus 12, you'll see that this is such a important event, a defining event, as I've said before, like America's 9/11 or maybe even America's 4th of July, France's Bastille Day. The actual calendar day is important here. It says that in Numbers 9, the first 3 verses, "Thus the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the first month of the 2nd year after they had come out of the land of Egypt, saying, Now let the sons of Israel observe the Passover at its appointed time. On the 14th day of the month, at twilight, you shall observe it at its appointed time." And of course, that's by the Jewish calendar. Passover is the calendar connection between the Jewish people and God's redeeming acts that he carried out on their behalf to get them out of Egypt and on toward the promised land. And there were 3 critical events or crucial events that happened when Israel celebrated their first Passover in the land of Israel. Joshua says that in chapter 4, verse 19, that on the 10th day of the first month, again the Jewish calendar, they circumcised that whole new desert generation, that wilderness generation of Jewish men. And you can imagine that was a painful event for them, and it immobilized them for at least 3 days afterwards. If you see what happened with Jacob in Genesis 34 and his sons and taking advantage of that, or in Joshua 5:8, you'll see that again. But the Lord declares that that physical circumcision has also a sign, typikos, if it were in Greek, this prophetic symbolism. And it says in Joshua 5:9, then Yahweh, or the Lord, rather, said to Joshua, today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. So this unclean generation that had come out with Egypt all over them, even though they've gone 40 years in the wilderness, they are take on this physical cutting to make this clean break, even after all that time, from Egypt's uncleanliness. So the entire nation celebrated their first Passover on the evening of the 14th of the first month near Gilgal on those desert plains at the Arabah outside of Jericho. And for the first time of history, the Passover became kind of an Israeli holiday as well, that was celebrated in the land of the promise. So in Deuteronomy 26, it talks about this land that's flowing with milk and honey that they've gone into. And so it becomes more of a celebratory event than it has been previously, as they're going through the wilderness and remembering coming out of Egypt. But Joshua's Passover is ripe with all this prophetic significance. God had now brought the Jewish people into their promised land, and the byword is now out with the old, in with the new. And that's what I'd like to leave you with today. Yahweh's prophetic promises were now to be actualized through Israel's physical and spiritual efforts. And so I want to leave you with a thought that I want to pick up in the next couple of days. I want to talk about a delayed Passover. This is an unusual time, and we don't have the ability to gather together, or at least it's not wise to do so at this time in the ways that you normally would for Passover and the Passover Seder. And I would encourage you to think about this passage, again from the book of Numbers, because there's a clause. It's kind of an out clause allowing for a delayed Passover. In Numbers 9 through 13, the Lord gave instructions to Moses, and any Jew who missed celebrating the Passover at the proper time because of extenuating circumstances for whatever reason it was, they could celebrate it exactly 1 month later on the 10th day of the second month. And so tomorrow I'd like to talk about some significant events, for example, like Hezekiah, Josiah, and revivals that took place when there was a delayed Passover. But God bless you for today. May you have peace and shalom in your household.